All right. Hello, Linda. How are you? Okay, it is 7 o'clock, so we're going to get on time because we want to use every second of the hour. My name is Kowalski Salter, and I am the Executive Director of the 1st Division Museum. And I can tell you we are in for a treat tonight. We have Linda Hervieux, and I will talk about her in a second. But first of all, I want to go over a few ground rules. We used to say our traditional date with histories, but this has become our new date with histories in the virtual world. So I do want to give some ground rules. First of all, as we normally do, we will save the last 15 minutes of this program for Q&A. So after we hear from Linda, each and every one of you will be able to put your questions forward. And the way we do that is to use the Q&A feature on your computer. So use the Q&A feature on your computer, and my teammate, Laura Sears, there she is, my teammate, Laura Sears, will make sure she gets to as many questions as possible. Please do not use the hand-raising function on your system. I will say up front, and obviously I'm coming through great, Linda's coming through great, I can see Laura, but we apologize up front if we have any technical difficulties. All three of us have rehearsed and checked everything out, and each one of us has a backup system. So we are going to knock on wood that we have the same success that we have always had in our past programs. We have not had a single technical problem, and so Laura, great job. So maybe I shouldn't talk about that too long.
No, don't jinx it.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next and last thing. I think this is our second or third program where we now have Illinois teachers who have signed on. So number one, we want to welcome you to this program. And if you have not signed up or registered for the professional development aspect of this program, please reach out to my teammate, Laura Sears, through your Zoom registration, and we can make sure that you get the information you need. And we hope you continue to tune in because, as most of you know, museums are educational institutions. And so we're in for a treat tonight. So this is where I go and read, so I make sure I get everything in order. Linda Hervieux is an American writer, journalist, and photographer who lives in Paris, France. Her book, Forgotten, The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes, chronicles the story of D-Day's only Black combat unit and their brutal journey through segregated Jim Crow America to freedom in Great Britain and on ultimately to the beaches of Normandy in France, and actually continuing to fight across France. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, New York Daily News, the Daily Beast, Times, NBCnews.com, and others. And so when I read, I get tongue-tied because then I have to read everything. I'm pretty good just talking off the cuff. So I do want to say this is not in her bio, but she has appeared in a lot of places. To include, I know she's been to several national level museums and has given great presentations. Just last year on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, she was at the National World War II Museum, and several years ago, she gave a presentation at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And one of the reasons we are excited is a lot of my teammates, to include Laura, they have this book club, and they just read your book recently, Linda. I happen to have read it back in 2015, being a historian. And I will tell you, for the educators, when I read this, I was like, this is a journalist writing almost like a historian. So I will commend you for capturing the essence of life for these soldiers even before they went into the military. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Linda, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Great, just
Perfect.
fine.
All right, so we've passed the first hurdle. So this is fantastic. So many thanks to the 1st Division Museum and Director Kowalski Salter and Laura Sears, the extraordinary program coordinator, for inviting me to speak here. The archivists at the 1st Division Museum, I really want to give a shout out to. It was thanks to them that I was able to do a lot of my research regarding Omaha Beach because the unit that I wrote about, the only African-American combat unit at D-Day, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, landed with the 1st Division. And during the landing, they were effectively infantry soldiers, though they had a very different mission that I'll be talking about. I needed to find information on the landing, and thanks to the experts at the museum, provided me with landing charts and helped me interpret those charts. And it was really extraordinary, the resources there. And even more so when I tell you later about the lack of records that exist for World War II. So I was really, really quite thrilled to have that help. And also, the museum has included the 320th in a mural in their D-Day gallery, and the 320th Hero Medic Waverly Woodson, who I'll be speaking about, is included in the Medics mural. So before I get started about this battalion and other units in World War II, I wanted to ask you a question, something to bear in mind as I'm speaking tonight. Who are our heroes and who were our historians? Who determines the picture we have in our memories of our shared history as Americans? Who are the historians recording our present history? Will future generations need to correct the record as we have had to do? These are the questions that are on my mind. We Americans are told to remember our history. It is something we hear all the time. Remember. School children learn about the ride of Paul Revere, but not always the actions of Crispus Attucks, the runaway slave who was the first to die in the Boston Massacre. We're told to remember the Civil War, whose battles are still reenacted today. There are tens of thousands of plaques across the South remembering that war and the heroes of the Confederate States of America. Yet until very recently, there were no markers to slavery, to the generations of enslaved men, women, and children of color who touched American shores more than 400 years ago. We're implored to remember the Alamo, but not the war of attrition waged on African Americans after the Civil War, not Jim Crow, that system of legal segregation codifying white supremacy and perpetuating unspeakable racism into our lifetimes. We have monuments to remember the men who died for freedom in the First World War more than a century ago. But until April 2018, when the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery, Alabama, there were no monuments to the nearly 4,000 African Americans lynched between 1877 and 1950. In 1919 alone, 77 Black men were killed by lynch mobs. Many of those murders were public events with children among the gleeful crowd collecting fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs. Some of those men killed in 1919 were veterans in uniform. 2 of them were burned alive. And of course, the greatest generation of the Second World War are still very much on our minds. There are museums and memorials dedicated to these very deserving men and women. They fill the pages of many, many books, and they still fascinate on our movie screens, but not all of them. Some men, even those who were stars in their day, were forgotten. I'd like to tell you about them, and I'll begin with the African Americans of D-Day. And I'll be sharing my screen, and let's see if this works. Okay. In June 2009, for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, the French government honored an American veteran named William Garfield Dabney. They gave him the Legion of Honor, that country's highest decoration, for his service on June 6, 1944. Bill was a member of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American combat unit at D-Day. These men were charged with a strange mission: to raise silver balloons over 2 of the 5 invasion beaches in Normandy, the American beaches, Omaha and Utah. The balloons formed a defensive curtain over the coast to protect the men and materiel from dive bombing German planes. And this is the only known photo of the 320th with a barrage balloon on Omaha Beach. The balloons worked like so. So if an enemy plane snagged the cable, the balloons were flown from the ground by a winch. You can see in this graphic. It would become trapped as if in a spider's web. And the balloons that went to war packed a secret punch. A small bomb would descend and a good hit could take out a wing or explode the gas tank. Barrage balloons were also on the 2 coasts of the US. They flew from San Diego to the Canadian border. And their mission was also to protect against invading aircraft. We reporters wrote about Bill Dabney in 2009, and we noted that his battalion was all Black. Well, what did that mean? It meant that the enlisted men and some of the non-commissioned officers were Black, and perhaps a few of the officers up to first lieutenant in this unit were Black, but the top officers were always white. Bill Dabney received his medal at a ceremony at Invalides in Paris, the French temple of all things military, where Napoleon is buried under the gold dome. After the ceremony, Bill shook the hands of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. Bill had no idea who they were until his son Vinny told him, but he knew very well that there were no men of color storming Omaha Beach in their movie, Saving Private Ryan. We do, however, see their balloons. In fact, no movies about D-Day show Black soldiers. All Black veterans know this. Few books about D-Day mention the 320th or that there were nearly 2,000 African-American troops on the Normandy beaches by the end of that extraordinary day. The 320th was among 2 Black units given a commendation by General Eisenhower for their service, yet we don't know about them. Why does that matter? Well, there are many people who consider D-Day to be among the most important days of the 20th century, for the Allied commanders knew that if they could get their troops onto those beaches, up and over those bluffs, it was only a matter of time until their troops would be marching through Berlin. I would argue that to exclude a significant portion of our population from that epic battle does America a tremendous disservice. The great General Omar Bradley said that all men who landed on Omaha Beach were heroes, yet there were heroes among the heroes. And as I began research into my book, I learned that one of the men of the 320th, a college student, would become a star in Black America and beyond for his service on Omaha Beach. He would be nominated for the Medal of Honor. He would not get it. None of the 1 million African Americans who served in World War II received America's highest honor until 1997, when Bill Clinton awarded 7 of them. Those awards came after an independent study commissioned by the Army found that pervasive racism within the ranks denied deserving Black soldiers the decorations they deserved and the opportunities they deserved. I'd like to tell you more about that 320th soldier. His name was Waverly Bernard Woodson, Jr. So this is from chapter 8, The Greatest Hour of my book. Waverly Woodson squinted into the distance. From the deck of the boat, he could see little. A thick cloud blanket hung overhead, and the heavy air pressed in from all sides. Drenched fatigues clung to Woodson's weary limbs. For hours now, he had peered into the blackness. A stripe of pink brightened the eastern horizon, first light. In the dark, choppy waters of the English Channel, Woodson found serenity, even beauty. It would be one of his last tranquil moments on this very long day. It was a strange place to find peace. Above, the sky hummed with Allied planes, and all around, thousands of vessels of every size steamed toward France. On Woodson's ship, men were gray with seasickness. Their single Army-issue vomit bag was long used up, so they heaved into their steel helmets, then tipped them over the side to be rinsed in the cresting swells. When that effort proved too much, they heaved wherever they could. Puddles of sick pooled at their ankles. The metal boat pitched forward and back with each roll. Dying would be better than this. Some of them said that. The storied channel had thwarted generations of marauders to keep Britannia safe, at least most of the time. The Roman Emperor Caligula's soldiers mutinied rather than sail these waters thick with mermaids. On this day, the invaders were heading in the opposite direction, their mission to conquer a continent systematically crushed by an enemy for whom freedom meant very little. To Woodson, freedom meant a great deal. He had lived it fully for the first time in a friendly village in Oxfordshire, where he'd met white people pleased to be his friend and a postmistress happy to dance with him. That might not have seemed like much to other men, but Woodson would never forget it. For Woodson, this journey to France was a most unexpected chapter in his young life. Odds were low that a Black man would be in this landing, yet Woodson was used to defying expectations. Unlike many of his friends in West Philadelphia, Woodson hadn't waited for a draft notice. He'd left his pre-med studies at Lincoln University, where he was in his second year, and enlisted in the Army on December 15, 1942. His younger brother, Eugene Lloyd Woodson, had signed up too and was stationed in Texas with a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen. It was a source of tremendous pride for their parents, and the doings of the Woodson brothers would become regular items in the Black newspapers back home. There were two armies in America in World War II, Black and white. There were two of everything: barracks, mess halls, service clubs, buses, and train cars. It was a highly inefficient and extremely expensive way to run an army. Yet there was one sector that was integrated: officer candidate school. The Army didn't think that Black men were smart enough to score high enough on the entrance exam, an exam heavily weighted to favor whites and their school learning, so they didn't bother to set up a separate system. But Woodson scored high on the test and trained as an anti-aircraft artillery officer. In the end, there were no officer positions available to him. This was a common story for Black officers whose service was limited by quotas and the rule that they not lead white officers junior to them. So Woodson was assigned to train as a medic with the 320th. On the morning of June 6th, he was headed to Omaha Beach with 4 of the other medics. In spite of the turbulent seas, the order to go had been a relief. Woodson and the 4 medics had endured several uncomfortable days aboard this metal bucket, jockeying for space with 6 men. Behind the boat carrying the medics, the rest of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was scattered among more than 150 landing craft. Thousands of barrage balloons had been inflated in England by Royal Air Force crews and then tethered to ships and smaller craft for the journey to France. Floating high above the ships, the balloons formed a miles-wide aerial curtain, their shining silvery shapes carved in relief against the flat pewter sky. Their job was to protect the fleet from German dive bombers, which would be loath to tangle with the lethal balloon cables. Once ashore, the men of the 320th would rush the balloons onto the beach, transferring the protective curtain to land. Most of the 621 men in the 320th Assault Force were headed to a 5-mile-long, crescent-shaped patch of sand called Omaha Beach. It was known as Beach 13. The Americans had renamed it, and it was one of the 5 beaches the Allies had to seize on June 6th in the 17 hours of daylight available to them. War planners expected a bloodbath on Omaha, the most challenging terrain, where enemy guns lay hidden in scrub-covered bluffs as high as 170 feet. Omaha is where the medics were headed. They would be the first African Americans ashore if they made it to the beach alive. Woodson made it to the beach alive, just barely. As the boat carrying Woodson and the medics approached Omaha Beach, all eyes were on the water. Around them, men bobbed in a sea made red by their own blood. Those still alive waited to be pulled from the drink by boats that might never come. The skippers of the landing craft had been ordered to ignore their cries for help, and men in motor launches with megaphones dissuaded those with second thoughts. "You are not a rescue ship," hollered one of them. "Get on shore." First, Woodson's craft hit a mine, which blew out the motor. Then another blast exploded on the right side, felling troops like matchsticks. The heavy fire kept coming. The LCT's 40-millimeter guns, which had been blazing moments earlier, now lay silent. The bodies of their gunners hung lifeless, as if from a gruesome clothesline. A shell landed on the hood of a Jeep, incinerating the 4 men inside. Woodson crouched beside a truck filled with medical supplies. Shells missed the ship and exploded in the water, sending a shower of burning metal shards raining on deck. A soldier beside Woodson was hit and killed. Woodson's lower extremities burned. He reached down and brought up a hand covered in blood. "I am dying," he thought. One of the medics slapped dressings on his buttocks and inner thigh, ripped open by shrapnel. "Close," Woodson would say later. "Mighty close." The medics tended to the few men still living. The helpless craft drifted to a stop. The ramp fell with a bang. And to Woodson's surprise, the tank came alive. It rolled down the ramp onto the beach and turned right. The men followed it, splashing down in 4 feet of water. Woodson and medics Eugene Worthy and Alfred Bell, both from Memphis, hit the beach and ran, slugs popping mini geysers of sand at their feet. Woodson looked back and saw the tank's turret in flames. No men were coming out. It was 9 a.m. In the shelter of the shingle, Woodson unpacked a tent roll he had pulled out of the water. Now there was a medical station. The rising tide carried in the dead and threatened to drown the living. Under constant fire, the medics dragged the wounded and the dead out of the shooting gallery at the water's edge. Their Red Cross brassards made them easy targets for German snipers hiding in the bluffs, who ignored the rules of war and fired on many medics that day. There were too many men who needed saving. Their cries for help would haunt Woodson. On Omaha, war was a great equalizer. At that time, Woodson would say later, they didn't care what color my skin was. Throughout the day and night and into the next day, Woodson worked through his pain to save lives. He pulled out bullets, patched gaping wounds, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a right foot. When he thought he could do no more, he resuscitated 4 drowning men. 30 hours after he set his boots on Omaha Beach, Woody Woodson collapsed. There is a sole piece of paper at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that proves that Waverly Woodson was nominated for the Medal of Honor. It is a handwritten note from an aide in the War Department to an aide in the White House that says, a Negro from Philadelphia was recommended for a suitable award, and that U.S. General John Lee in Britain upgraded that recommendation to the Medal of Honor. The note continues, this is a big enough award that the president can give it personally, as he had in the case of some white boys. There is no trace today of the records that explain Waverly Woodson's medals. It's a common story. Only 1% of Army records from World War II exist today. And a fire in the Army's archives in St. Louis, Missouri in 1973 destroyed 80% of personnel records. What we know is this: Woodson got a Purple Heart for his injuries and belatedly a Bronze Star for his service on Omaha Beach. To the Army, the note in the Truman Library is hearsay, but there is further proof of Woodson's actions in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, Waverly Woodson was a huge star. The crusading black press hailed him as #1 invasion hero. White newspapermen came to interview him. Stars and Stripes wrote that Woodson and the medics covered themselves with glory on D-Day. Woodson returned home a celebrity, and the accolades continued. He was invited to recount his heroics on a nationwide radio show, and the black press began calling on the White House to award him the Medal of Honor. Significantly, stapled to a note in the Truman Library, is a press release issued by the Army on August 28, 1944, detailing Woodson's heroism. That the Army would praise the individual actions of a black soldier on Omaha Beach was nothing short of extraordinary. There is a white soldier who did receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 6, actions remarkably similar to Woodson's, except he was not injured. I detail what he did in chapter 9 of my book. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the French government chose a trio of Americans to honor. They flew them to France and presented them with a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. They included Waverly Woodson and his wife, Joanne. "I was the only Black man of the three," Woodson said proudly. He was 72 years old. Waverly Woodson died on August 12, 2005. His grave is in Arlington National Cemetery, where America buries its heroes. Every Memorial Day, Joanne visits his white marble grave with an armful of her husband's favorite red roses. In June 2015, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to a Black soldier from World War I named Henry Johnson. This is Henry Johnson wearing his French Croix de Guerre medal. Johnson was a member of the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry from New York. He single-handedly fought off a German raiding party that attacked the trench he was guarding, using up all of his weapons until all he had left was his bolo knife. His story is detailed in chapter 2 of my book. Like Woodson, Johnson was a star. He made headlines from coast to coast. What most of those readers perhaps did not know was that Henry Johnson and his regiment were given over to French command by the American General John J. Pershing, who, contrary to the popular version of his story, had little use for Black men in his army. The Hellfighters fought in French uniforms alongside French poilus and received French medals for their extraordinary record. They served more days on the front lines than any other American unit. The French called them the men of bronze. The Germans called them Hellfighters for their ferocity in battle. Johnson died 11 years after the war in poverty, without even a Purple Heart for his injuries, and therefore no medical benefits to treat his wartime injuries. In a ceremony at the White House, President Obama said, "It is never too late to say thank you." I would like to step back now to 1941. In 1941, when the men of the 320th began receiving their draft notices, the Army was a bastion of racism. Its ranks were dominated by Southern commanders who determined that Southern officers like them were best suited to, quote, handle Black men. So how bad was it for Black soldiers? Well, to understand the world these men were thrust into, it's necessary to understand that Army policy at the time was a lesson in what happens when racism meets pseudoscience. The science at the time held that Black brains were smaller than white brains, and sometimes hat size was used to measure this difference. An Army college study from 1925, still on the books during World War II, was indicative of the type of thinking that underpinned Army policy toward the Black soldier in World War II. And I'm going to read you part of that. And it seems even in the 40s incredible that this could be the policy of the Army, and it is disturbing. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. He is by nature subservient and naturally believes himself inferior to the white. He is jolly, tractable, lively, and docile by nature, but through real or supposed harsh or unjust treatment may become sullen and stubborn. He has not the physical courage of the white. He simply cannot control himself in fear of some danger in the degree that the white man can. His psychology is such that he willingly accepts hard labor, and for this reason can well be employed in labor troops or other non-combatant branches. The Negro is immoral. He simply does not see certain things as wrong. The Negro is one of the most secretive in the world. While the Negro undoubtedly has a state of mind bordering on resentment against the white, this feeling is numbed by his easygoing nature. The Negro's growing sense of importance will make them more and more of a problem, and racial problems may well be expected to increase. Well, that last line was certainly true. Anger in Black America toward the treatment of their men in uniform was rising and would be blamed in part for sparking more than 200 race riots that would rock America in 1943. One of the men who got one of those draft notices in June 1941 was a 21-year-old in Atlantic City named Wilson Caldwell Monk. And this is Wilson Monk with a barrage balloon. For Monk, being drafted meant a steady paycheck. The $30 he would earn monthly in the Army was a measure of security he very much needed. In Atlantic City, the country's first planned resort town, there were 3 months to earn your money by stringing together as many jobs as you could before Labor Day, when the curtain fell and Atlantic City shut up tight. The odds of getting a decent job during the long, cold winter were slight. At that time, America was not at war, so Wilson Monk expected a 1-year commitment. He was in for a surprise, and an even bigger surprise when he boarded a train and headed south to his first Army training camp. Somewhere north of Washington, D.C., Wilson Monk was told he had to switch to the Negro Car. He had no idea what that meant. The Negro Car was always hard by the noisy, dirty coal engine, so a soldier in uniform would arrive to wherever he was going, covered in black soot. The train south was the first taste of Jim Crow for the North's black recruits, who would arrive at their first day of boot camp already fuming. Jim Crow, as you know, was a series of laws in the southern United States that ensured the separation of the races. What you may not know is that they included such crimes as, quote, pretending to be a white man. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws spread throughout the South like a poisonous weed, so that by 1890, the races were effectively separate and black men and women had to step off sidewalks and avert their eyes when passing whites. At an Army base in Pennsylvania, black troops were warned that any contact with a white woman, whether voluntary or not, would be considered rape and the penalty death. Wilson Monk was stationed here at Camp Tyson, an Army base in northwestern Tennessee, built for the purpose of teaching men to fly barrage balloons. Of the 30 or so units that trained at Tyson, 4 battalions were black. Chapter 5 of my book describes their experiences there. I called this chapter, "We Were Like Little Dogs," because this is how Sergeant Samuel L. Madison from Columbus, Ohio, described his time there to me. And this is Sam Madison in 2010, a few months before he died. One day in the spring of 1943, Wilson Monk and some friends boarded a train and headed to Memphis on a weekend pass. They were excited to check out Beale Street and the astounding things happening there with black music. Their first stop was a diner where Monk asked for change to play the jukebox. The man behind the counter threw back a handful of nickels and told Monk, "If you weren't in uniform, you wouldn't get nothing from me." What Monk didn't know was that wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army usually posed problems for black soldiers among Southern whites who saw a proud display of patriotism by a black man as a provocation, and it only got worse. Later, Monk and his friends went looking for a place to grab a bite. Outside one restaurant, they watched, incredulous, as a long line of German prisoners of war filed inside. Black men were not welcome there, even black officers. Most Americans don't know that there were 425,000 German and Italian prisoners of war interned in the United States during World War II, most of them at Army bases in the South, where these POWs enjoyed privileges not accorded to black soldiers. The fact that these enemy prisoners enjoyed often backslapping treatment by their white guards was extremely painful for soldiers like Wilson Monk, who, even 7 decades after the war, spoke about it to me with fresh hurt. But it was in hearing this story from Wilson Monk that I got a lesson about the northern version of Jim Crow. Wilson Monk told me that the restaurant in Memphis was called Child's, and he knew that chain because there was one in Atlantic City. I said, "But you could eat in that one." And he said, "Oh, no, we couldn't." And that was when I realized how bad life in the North was for African Americans. It was a lesson I hadn't learned in any of the schools I had attended, not in any sort of detail, and I had an average Northern Massachusetts education. I wondered why we Americans must take specialized classes to learn our own history, and it is one of the reasons why I wrote Forgotten. Who records our history? If not for the French government, we might not know about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. We might not know that there were nearly 2,000 African-American troops in Normandy on D-Day. But these soldiers of color were not alone. This is Dory Miller. He was the first hero of World War II, the first hero. The Navy initially did not want to recognize him and suppressed the story of his heroism at Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese sneak attack got underway, Miller, a cook aboard the USS West Virginia, jumped behind an anti-aircraft artillery gun and began firing. He took out a few Japanese planes with guns he had never been trained to use. 15 men were awarded the Medal of Honor for their service on December 9, 1941, including the mortally wounded commander of the ship, whom Miller dragged to safety. But not Miller. He got the Navy Cross, which at that time was third place. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, fought in 5 countries and captured 30 towns. The 183 days they served in combat was more than any other unit. Their commander, General George S. Patton Jr., made it clear what was expected of them. Everyone has their eyes on you, Patton told them. Most of all, your race. Don't let them down. The Panthers won many decorations, including 11 Silver Stars, but they would have to wait until 1978 for their Distinguished Unit citation given to them by President Jimmy Carter. America's first Black pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron spent the war treated like, quote, pariahs, as Airman Lee Archer put it. Denied proper training and ignored by their commanders, they went on to fly more than 15,000 individual sorties. The bomber pilots escorted by the red-tailed planes had no idea the men who led them to safety were Black. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are well known, but it wasn't until a TV movie aired in 1995 that brought their story into our popular consciousness. The 92nd Infantry Division, with heroic roots dating back to the 19th century Buffalo Soldiers, were vilified during World War II. They were called incompetent and cowardly, yet their record reveals otherwise. In July 1944, one of their regiments, the 366th, was sent to mount a high-stakes frontal assault on seasoned German troops in Italy. They had only a few days' training and inferior weapons. Their commander, General Edward Almond, had greeted their arrival with these words, quote, I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on you seeing combat, and I shall see that you get combat and your share of the casualties. This is Almond above. And so, despite suffering 3,000 casualties, and despite a system that shortchanged Black soldiers, the men of the 92nd collected scores of decorations, including 208 Silver Stars and 1,000 Bronze Stars. In December, we will mark the 76th anniversary of another decisive World War II moment, the Battle of the Bulge. After Germany's surprise attack in the Ardennes forest in Belgium left 80,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured, more than 2,000 Black service troops answered an urgent call for volunteer riflemen. Many of them were in the labor and service units that Black soldiers were assigned to in disproportionate numbers, and they took demotions for their chance to fight. They impressed their white commanders with their ferocity and drive. Although assigned to segregated platoons, they were the first men of color to fight shoulder to shoulder with white men since the Revolutionary War. I have never seen any soldiers who performed better in combat than you have, one general told them. Yet many men wouldn't see the medals they were due until years after the war. 2 New York vets waited until the year 2000 for their Bronze Stars. There are many stories like this. African Americans served with distinction wherever they were assigned. And not just Black men, more than 4,000 women of color served their country with distinction. On the subject of decorations, of the D-Day veterans I interviewed, Bill Dabney was not the only one to receive the French Legion of Honor. Henry Parham got one too. On the anniversary of D-Day in June 2013, the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. invited Henry Parham of the 320th and his wife Ethel to a ceremony with 18 other American vets. I am no hero, Henry said after receiving his medal. Henry called his service on Omaha Beach and beyond a privilege, even though, he says, we were treated like second-class citizens. Henry is the last of the men featured in my book who is still with us today. He is 98 years old and doing just fine with the wonderful Ethel in Pittsburgh. I'd like to close by telling you a story of hope that is perhaps instructive today. In our time, a time of great division, with protests roiling our cities and people crying out to be recognized as equal citizens with equal rights, it is interesting to note how the African Americans of World War II marginalized and reviled in many corners of their own land, were treated abroad. After leaving Tennessee, the men of the 320th boarded train cars headed for New York, where they trudged aboard the Acatania, a luxury ocean liner converted into a troop carrier. It was one of the 3 fastest ships in the world. Without a convoy, the ship sailed out of New York Harbor, past the Statue of Liberty, and headed into the hunting grounds of the North Atlantic, where German subs were gunning for ships exactly like theirs, packed with as many as 16,000 young Americans and Canadians. The sinking of any one of them would have been the greatest disaster to befall the Allies. The men arrived in Scotland in November 1943, and for the next 7 months in the villages of Oxfordshire, England, and in Wales, they would enjoy liberties they had never thought possible. In this land, white people were happy to meet them, share their meager war rations, and forge lasting friendships. In Britain, Black servicemen and women were Americans first, with funny accents and bright, white, bewildering smiles. In a nation made gray by the drudgery of war, their presence was incandescent. It was like Hollywood came to town, a man in Wales told me. He was a boy when the Black GIs arrived one day, and he has never forgotten them. The importance of these experiences abroad for hundreds of thousands of Black GIs cannot be overemphasized. It was epic. It was through their time abroad, in Europe, in the Pacific, even in occupied Germany, that African Americans like Wilson Monk, Waverly Woodson, Henry Parham, and Bill Dabney learned that race hatred was not a natural state of affairs. These experiences abroad would help shape the budding American civil rights movement that would rock the United States in the coming decades. Our man from Atlantic City, Sergeant Wilson Monk, was billeted in the hall of a stately stone church called Trinity Methodist in the village of Abersochen in South Wales. One day he asked the church organist if he and his friends might attend Sunday services. "Well, of course you can," said the organist, Jeffrey Pryor, who was also the village milkman. Pryor had no idea that in America none of these men would have set foot in a white church. Then Jeffrey Pryor did the homesick GI who missed his sweetheart Martina one better. He introduced him to this woman, his wife, Jessie. The Pryor's 18-year-old son, Keith, was off fighting with the British forces, and Wilson Monk became their surrogate son. Like most Britons, the Pryors had never met a person of color until the Americans came, and they in turn were the first white people who Wilson had ever called his friends. And so an extraordinary correspondence began between Jessie Pryor and Wilson Monk's mother, Rosita, in Atlantic City. And I'd like to end by reading you just a piece of one of those letters. "My dear Mrs. Monk, how are you? I expect you will be very surprised receiving this letter from me. I feel I must write you and tell you how very delighted we are meeting Wilson and having him in our home. Mrs. Monk, you have a son to treasure and feel very proud of. We love him very dearly and will do anything in the world for him. All we regret is we cannot have him home more, but duties won't allow. He does come as often as possible. We have told him he can look upon our home as his home while he is in our country, and I will try to fill your place, if only in a small way. But don't worry too much about him while he is here. We shall take every care of him. If ever he is ill or in any way wanting, we shall be there. We look upon him now as our own. Mother to mother, very sincerely with loving thoughts, Jessie Pryor, XXXXX." Wilson Monk and his war bride, Martina, were married for 60 years. One last note about Waverly Woodson. There is a campaign underway to persuade the powers that be in Washington to award the Medal of Honor to Woodson, led by his family and the office of Maryland Senator Chris Van Holland. The homepage of my website links to their petition. Please consider adding your name to it. It takes only a minute.
Perfect. Well, we don't have anybody to, I feel like we can't clap, so here I am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Linda. We do
Thank
have a
you,
couple
Laura.
questions to get us started. Are you ready for some Q&A? Again, some
I
instructions.
am.
If you have questions for Linda, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. You can go ahead and click that and type in any questions you might have. I will do my best to get to any and all questions in the time we have allotted, but let's kick things off. The first question we had was, after the D-Day landing, so D-Day +1, what happened to the 320th? Did they remain on the beach?
Yes, they stayed on the beach. They were on the beaches for 140 days. Their job was to stay on the beach. So while the infantry troops and all the other troops that followed had to get up and over those bluffs, their job was to stay and to protect those beaches, to protect the men coming from the dive bombing German planes. And so, yeah, so they stayed, and they stayed until the weather made shipping impossible.
All right. And then we had another question in regards to what happened after World War II. What were some of the their lives like after World War II? What kind of jobs did they have? What kind of careers did they go into?
That's a very good question. You know, what happened to these men and the other African-American soldiers of World War II is a very instructive tale. I devote an epilogue to their stories, but also to the larger picture of Black soldiers. In short, I'll tell you that a lot of soldiers benefited from the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the GI Bill as basically allowing a middle class post-war to develop that were able to buy homes with low rate mortgages. They were able to go to college and other trade schools. Well, that was very much a white story. So for the men in my book who tried to use the GI Bill, what they found was a lot of doors slammed in their faces. So Bill Dabney, who I began speaking about, Henry Parham, they wanted to, for example, learn the trade of the day, which was television repair, and they were denied access to programs like that because they were Black. They were also unable to buy homes because banks would not loan money to them. So when we talk today about communities developing and wealth developing from the ownership of property, remember that these soldiers who fought for our country could not buy homes because banks would not loan them money. So they could have government benefits, but if no banks would give them the money. So men like Bill Dabney had to be very crafty. They found, he was from Roanoke, Virginia. He found a Black-owned insurance company that would provide a mortgage in North Carolina. There were all kinds of stories like that, having to go around the system that would not welcome them. So Bill Dabney worked into his 80s at his own floor business. They installed floor and carpets, Dabney Floors in Roanoke, Virginia. Henry Parham, who was not allowed to be a TV repairman, was trained as a tailor. He did not want to be a tailor. He eventually went into construction and operating heavy equipment. He is living retired in Pittsburgh today. Wilson Monk was able to learn how to make dentures and other sort of dentistry like that. So he worked for years. Waverly Woodson, unfortunately, it's a sad story with Waverly Woodson. He was not able to pursue his goal to get into medical school. He always thought that it was quotas that kept him out, and also the fact that he stayed in the Army, he thought a little bit too long, and then that enabled him to miss out on a lot of opportunities that way. But he trained as a technician. He ended up working in lab techs for the National Institutes of Health, and he did lots of things his whole life. He was really pretty much a genius. He built his family's television from scratch and stereo just for fun. He grew champion roses. It's just really astounding. But beyond the men of this book, it is interesting to note that the Tuskegee Airmen, the pilots, were not able to get to work as commercial pilots in this country. They were not even given interviews. And so their story and the story of the men in this book is largely a story of missed opportunity.
So thank you. I do want to get to our next question, which this guest last name is Monk, so I wonder if there's any relation there. Just wants to know if there's going to be a copy of this program. There absolutely will be. We are recording this evening. We will be putting it on the 1st Division Museum's YouTube. And now that I have your name, I'm happy to email that out to you as well. No questions here. Just wanted to say thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. One guest loves your book and wants to know if you plan on writing any more World War II history.
We'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of stories to tell.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
In what capacity did the African Americans serve? Were they recognized for their efforts, or were they primarily also overlooked?
For the African Americans in what?
This guest does not specify further. So let me get some more information from that guest and we'll go on to our next question. Do you have any information about the transportation group, the Red Ball Express, which we also cover in our museum?
Well, the Red Ball Express, I do talk about them in the book. They're pretty storied. I mean, they were 75% men of color, and their story is a fantastic story. You know, they were the ones who supplied the front lines, so their supplies, you know, came in through the Normandy beaches. Again, the men in my battalion were protecting them and coming in. They loaded the trucks, they drove them along the front lines. It was super dangerous work, and yeah, their stories. We have a record of the Red Ball Express, and I'm not sure why some stories were recorded well and others weren't, but the Red Ball is one of the most storied tales of the war supply chain.
Do you know of any instances in which African Americans and Black soldiers remained in Europe after the war or went back to Europe?
You know, I am asked this question. That's a very good question. I am asked this question all the time. People say, why didn't these men stay after the welcome they got? Why did they come back to a country that was treating them so badly? And one thing to note, when a lot of these men came back to the States, like in every other war that our country has had where African Americans have participated with bravery and heroism, they expected upon their return that things would be better. Things would be better for all of the people. Mm-hmm. And that was simply not the case. They disembarked, there were lines for white and colored, and they knew that nothing really was going to change. But you know what? This was home. You know, for Wilson Monk, this is where that beautiful woman Martina was. I mean, this is where their families were. They were not going to stay in Europe. They were not going to stay. Some did. Notably, and I talk about him in the book, one of the war correspondents for the Black newspapers stayed in Paris after the war because he could not abide American racism after seeing how things could be. And so we have these stories where we do have some stories like that, but for the most part, these men wanted to go home and they wanted their country to live up to its promise. They believed in America and they believed that things would be better.
So in your presentation, you mentioned African American and Black women serving in the military. Can you share any stories with that? Did any of those women receive any recognition or medals after the fact?
A lot of women were recognized after. One story that will always stick with me that I write about is a Postal Battalion of African American women who were in. Say it again. Sorry, Laura.
Oh, we share their story in our museum as well. They're interesting. I was jumping it.
Yeah, it's a really great story. And so I talk about how when they're in Birmingham in England, they're marching through the streets upon arriving, and they have these crisp uniforms, and they look absolutely fantastic and proud, and they are cheered. They are cheered by the people in England, and for many of these women, it just brought them to tears because they never got any recognition like that, especially when they were leaving from the ports in the South where they left, some of them left from. And so this for them was really, made a huge impression. What they found, though, in the towns of England is that whenever there was any segregation brought into these towns, it was brought in by the Americans. And they found that they could not use some of the same facilities. They also found that a lot of white commanders wanted to come through just to sort of look at them. And the commander of one of the units had arranged the chair that, you know, one of these generals would sit on so that the front legs were lower, so he would be so uncomfortable he would have to leave. And there's lots of stories like that, how they really were so well treated by the locals, but not so much by the Americans.
Absolutely. And we tell the story of the 6th AAA Postal Battalion in our museum. So another great reason to head over to 1st Division Museum.
Yeah, sorry. 6 triple. Yeah, sorry. I didn't name them. And, you know, their story is incredible. And their commander was an incredible woman too. It's a great story.
Do we know, did many of the soldiers, leave the service after the war? Did any of them become career soldiers? Do we have any knowledge on that?
Waverly Woodson stayed in for a while, of the men I wrote about. He stayed in for a while, but he did not make a career of it. And for the men I spoke to, the main reason was that they really were done. I mean, they could not wait to get out because Wilson Monk was still scarred by the treatment he received in the South. You know, another man that I spoke to from Baltimore had told me that he was so scared at his Southern camp of being arrested on a false charge and put on a chain gang and disappearing into this very specious criminal justice system that he wouldn't leave base. I mean, they were really, really scared. And so for a lot of these men, they had had enough. They did not want this treatment anymore, and they wanted to go back and try to build normal lives.
Yeah. We have another statement coming from another gentleman whose uncle served with the 320th. And I know this evening we have a couple of grandchildren and children and nieces and nephews of 320th veterans joining us this evening. So we want to thank you so much for your family's service this evening, and pleased that Linda can join us to share their story. Oh, this guest was very excited to meet you in Daunt Books in London. So happy to see you again.
I know who that is.
Uh-oh.
I know who that is.
Can you tell us a little bit what happened to Miller after his service at Pearl Harbor?
He was killed. He was killed a few months later in battle. It's a terrible story. It's a terrible story. He survives Pearl Harbor, and then his ship was hit and he was killed. It's a really sad story. And just to be clear about Dory Miller, he never wanted any acknowledgement about any of this. He was a very reluctant medal recipient, and I think you could see that in the picture of him. It's quite a picture where he looks proud but also scared, you know. So
yeah. How many living members or family members of the 320th were you able to interview for your book? Do we know if there's any available kind of oral histories from the 320th that are available that our public can enjoy?
Well, my book, but also my website has a page on every man that I could find. So if you go to the 320th gallery, you can click on their pictures and you can get more on everybody's story. And I've added to it, you know, with family members that have contacted me. We will put their oral histories together, and we will put them somewhere else. Nobody has asked me for them, but I am protecting all of this. I will keep that website up dedicated to them. I was able to find 12 men who were alive and were able to talk. And this is from 2009. The book finally came out in 2015. So it was sort of the very last times where we could find them. I found the families of many, many others. And there were certain men to give a big shout out to. Vinnie Dabney, who the son of Bill Dabney, helped me a great deal. Bill Davison. Bill Davison is the son of George Davison, who was a clerk in the 320th, who many years after the war wrote his experiences by hand. And when I started researching this, Bill sent me by email, page by page, taking pictures of each page, sent me that account, and has tirelessly worked to preserve his father's memory. The children of these men are just extraordinary. And remember, some of them didn't know that their fathers were at D-Day until I came and interviewed them either. Bill, obviously not Bill and Vinny, they were right up there promoting and promoting and promoting. But remember, a lot of these men did not think that what they were doing was extraordinary. A lot of us who speak to veterans know they don't want to be called heroes. They don't want to tell their stories. As they get older and they realize that we need to preserve these memories and that time is running out, a lot of them opened up. When I found Wilson Monk in 2010, and, you know, also, thankfully, we still have home numbers and phone books where when I found names, I could try to find them. Wilson Monk said to me, I've been waiting 50 years for someone to call me. So he was ready to tell me his story, and he became, you know, like a second father to me. It was very hard to lose him.
Again, we have guests who just are thanking you so much for keeping these stories alive. Can you tell us a little more about what prompted your interest in this book? This is something we talked about earlier, but everybody's interested. So what prompted your interest in this topic?
Well, it's not too complicated. I was a newspaper reporter, and I was looking for a story in 2009 for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, and I heard that the French government was going to honor one American, and that was Bill Dabney. And when I found Bill's story, I wrote a story for the New York Daily News about him, and I thought, what a shame that we should only do one story. You know, I've never heard of this. Most of the reporters there had no idea that the U.S. Army was segregated during World War II. We had no idea what those balloons were all about. We never heard about those. Britons had heard about the barrage balloons because they were flying over London, and they're iconic, and they're in photos and movies. But Americans didn't know anything about. We certainly didn't, and so it just seemed fascinating to me. And so I started looking into their story. And a friend said, "You know, that's a book," and I'd never written a book, so I thought, well, how does he know it's a book? I don't know it's a book. But if he hadn't suggested it, I don't know that I would have pursued it. Frankly, I was just a reporter. You know, I wasn't an author. So
well, it looks like there's more requests for you to write more. So It's gonna be our last question for the evening. And I just want to acknowledge that I did have a couple guests in the question and answers ask me for a copy of this presentation tonight. I have taken their names, and I will be sending you an email link probably latest on Monday last week, depends on how long it takes us to upload the presentations. I will get those out to you. If something happens and I do not email you, please know that you can always visit our YouTube page by going to the 1st Division Museum's main website, clicking on our YouTube link, it will be on there. But let's get to our last question. Is there anything more that we can do for Waverly Woodson's honor in addition to signing that petition? Is there any senator's offices that we can call? What can we do?
You know, Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen is still fighting this fight, and his staff is fantastic, and they could use all the support they can get. You know, I would lobby your local rep. I would call your senator's office to second this, to get in on it. The Congressional Black Caucus, you know, anybody who you think can make a difference. I really think that he's going to get that medal, and I really hope so for Joanne, his fabulous wife, and his family, who've really been dogged about this. And yeah, I hope so. So yes, thank you for any help on that too. So.
All right. Before we send everybody off this evening, again, we want to thank Linda for joining us and thank everybody for tuning in. If you do not have a copy of Linda's book, Forgotten, you can purchase it on cantini.org, which is our website, and you can click on the very top where it says shop, And in our virtual shop, you will find Linda's book, Forgotten. And just special because it's our Date with History speaker, I was told that the gift shop is giving free shipping on Linda's book, on only Linda's book. So it's the only item you're going to get free shipping on. But you can order Linda's book off of cantini.org. You can see the cover behind her of Forgotten. And I do want to give out one more information. Thank you, Kruoski. There it is. And I do want to give out one more shout out to our next Date with History, which is coming up on Thursday, September 10th. It's Chicago author David Krissinger, and he's going to be sharing a little bit about his research for his upcoming book about correspondent Ernie Pyle and his service in North Africa. And so we're looking forward to that as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was great.
Everybody have a wonderful weekend.
Okay. Night night.